I'd like to thank you all for coming to this panel. This panel is on international and comparative perspectives. We have 3 presentations, and our presentations will go about 15 to 20 minutes, and then we'll have some time for conversation afterwards. So our first presentation is by Sun Lim, and her collaborator, Gerald Goggin, could not attend today, so Sun will be presenting. The New Internet World, Problematizing the Internationalization of Media Studies. Thank you.
She'll be first, or he'll be first. Okay. So he'll present for 15 minutes, and then maybe you'll have 5. Oh, okay, we'll see. All right, if you need to have me shut down.
So thank you, everyone. My name is Sun Lim. I'm from the National University of Singapore, and I'm delighted to be here and to speak on behalf of my co-author, Professor Gerald Goggin at the University of Sydney, who unfortunately can't join us, and he won't be joining the ICA, but he will be at the IAMCR if you wish to catch up with him. So as I said, it's a real pleasure to be here, and we really wanted to thank the conference organizers for organizing this event, because we felt that this whole theme of New Internet Worlds really resonated with us. And part of it really has to do with an event that we were organizing slightly over a year ago. And this was a workshop that we were trying to organize, that we organized in Singapore in February 2012, because we recognized the dramatic transformations that were occurring in Asia as a result of mobile communication use. And also, you know, there were all these growing chasms between areas in Asia where smartphone penetration was going through the roof versus parts of Asia where even basic access to electricity is an issue. And we really wanted to get a group of scholars who were working both in and on Asia to share multiple perspectives from different geographical standpoints, different theoretical standpoints, different methodological practices, and so on. And certainly we were not disappointed. We managed to get together a really interesting group of people and these were scholars who were working on China, who were working on Philippines, working on India, and so on. And we also managed to have a nice mix of people talking about rural-urban issues, talking about, for example, locative media on the one extreme, and also people in mountainous regions and how they were using innovations of feature phones on the other extreme. So we managed to have interesting conversations with lots of comparative insights, and also very striking similarities, even despite the tremendous diversity in Asia. But even so, at the end of the 2 days, we were also, after 2 days of really interesting discussion, we did feel that there was so much more that could be done to understand mobile communication in Asia. And for one thing, from our interactions, not just amongst ourselves, but also separately with our colleagues in the region, we were well aware of the fact that there is a huge group of scholars who work in Asia, but in their native languages. And a lot of their work, however valuable, will never inform the greater academic community, simply because it continues to be published and disseminated in the native Asian language. And this is really, you know, very disappointing, because I know, for example, of some ethnographers who are working on hacker communities in Indonesia. I've met academics from Malaysia who are looking at how Islam shapes the way parents engage in mediation of the internet. We've also had colleagues from Vietnam who are also looking at rural-urban divides in terms of mobile communication use. And so all of these precious insights really would introduce so much meaningful diversity to our overall understanding of mobile communication and also more broadly internet use. And yet, unfortunately, a lot of this literature is not finding its way into academia. So that's why we were very keen on this whole theme of new internet worlds, because we thought that this theme of new internet worlds is a really useful departure point for us to consider how we can further internationalize media studies so that it can be more accommodating of this multiple multiple perspectives and alternative insights into our appreciation of the social impact of technology. So in our paper, we talk about the internationalization of media studies. And we really use the term media studies to more broadly encompass internet research as well as communication studies. So really we're using it as a broader umbrella term. Fundamentally, we feel that there can be a lot more done to internationalize media studies. And we talk in our paper about the different potentialities as well as the impediments that stand in the way of a more active internationalization of media studies. Excuse me. So I won't dwell too long on the potentialities. We've had some conversations about it this morning. Essentially, I think there is a widespread recognition of the fact that Asia is playing a very important trailblazing role in terms of how the internet is being used. If you look at the Asian population, it's extremely young, increasingly well-educated, highly technophilic. And so you're seeing very interesting innovations in terms of how mobile phones and other mobile media devices are being used. And also with the proliferation of mobile devices and also the increasing availability of cloud computing, we're seeing a tremendous amount of innovation within Asia. Interestingly, also within Asia, you're seeing, for example, a lot of migration of labor because of the booming economy. And for example, if you look at studies on migrants, Filipino workers, and the kinds of services that they're tapping into via the internet or mobile phone to keep in touch with their families or to send remittances, we're seeing a lot of innovations on that end as well as on the other end of smartphone innovations that people are using on the go in those countries where smartphone penetration is very, very rampant. And so, as I was saying, clearly Asia is the site or has the potential to birth various methodological and theoretical innovations. In terms of the academic community, we're also seeing an intensification of the study of media and communications. I think Asian students are very embracing of the next big thing. And so there's a lot of interest in majoring in media studies. And so that's really resulted in rising enrollments in media programs. And we're also seeing more universities around Asia developing media programs and media degrees. As a practicing academic, I've also found that there is a growing number, in a very encouraging way, a growing number of publication outlets that have a distinctly Asian focus, and that again is a remarkably encouraging trend. Based on some sources that I have found, there is the existence of more than 12 professional associations and research institutes that focus on Asian media and communication studies. I haven't done a rigorous count of these institutions, and if you know of more, please let me know, but it appears that there is quite a number. So again, all of these factors point to some very positive and encouraging trends in terms of the possible growth of media studies in Asia with an Asian focus. But it's really the impediments that we want to dwell a little bit more on here today. And one of the greatest impediments has got to be the persistence of Western-centric Anglophone paradigms. And this has long been observed. It's been observed as early as 1988 and probably before that. It's been observed as recently as 2009, and it will be observed here today, which is that, fundamentally we're seeing a great dominance of Western-centric paradigms. Earlier this morning, we had the benefit of seeing a young scholar talk about how he was using the Western concept of democracy and Chinese philosophy of Li and trying to sort of apply it to his understanding of political empowerment and democracy. So that was quite an interesting example of how he was kind of trying to break away from Western-centric paradigms. But certainly, as an educator, when I look through the syllabi of my courses, as well as those of my colleagues, a vast majority of the literature that we use is still primarily of the Anglophone tradition. Similarly, the cases, the articles that we prescribe for our students are also from a Western tradition. And this really leads to it's not problematic in and of itself, but it may potentially stifle greater innovation in terms of theorization that's more culturally specific, that's more accommodating of the Asian experience. Of course, I'm well aware of the discussion earlier that we had about how there are many Chinas. Just as there are many Chinas, there are many Asias. In fact, there are many, many, many Asias. So the sheer diversity of Asia as a region also makes it quite difficult, but that shouldn't stop us from aspiring towards some kind of more broadly grounded theorization that is grounded in Asian experiences and Asian data. And that brings me to my next point, which is that if we look at Asia today, as an academic who's been trained in the UK and then now working in Asia primarily, I do feel that the Asian environment of information exchange and knowledge sharing could be so much more enhanced. There isn't as vibrant a conference circuit as there could be, and there isn't a more active exchange of individuals across institutions and so on. And obviously, I think a lot more can be done to boost these kinds of exchanges. But more importantly, also beyond just the person-to-person exchange, it's also important to consider the fact that when you want to conduct Asian research, it's actually very difficult to find pan-Asian data that is sufficiently comprehensive, sufficiently robust, and sufficiently reliable. In fact, what little pan-Asian data we have out there always overrepresents certain countries and underrepresents some rather significant countries. And a lot of the pan-Asian data is also produced by private companies, private research companies that have specific commercial agenda. And again, this limits us in terms of how we can make more robust comparative analyses. We do see in Asian countries, for example, in Singapore, in Korea, in Japan, in China as well, there's a great deal of investment by the state in having data to understand technology adoption, to understand technology trends. But a lot of this data can never be used on a comparative basis simply because it's all customized for that particular country. And so this really inhibits comparative analysis. And the greatest contrast that I can draw is really with the European Union, because in the EU, there is a great concerted effort to fund pan-European research that generates data that is comparative, that really enables you to do very meaningful analysis in a way that cannot be done in Asia at the moment. And so what happens is that you have all of this data in different countries, but they all exist in silos, and they're really not sort of interacting with each other. So another issue which I had touched upon earlier is clearly the fact that we have scholars in Asia who are working primarily in their native Asian languages. You also have scholars in Asia, such as myself, who operate primarily in English. You have some who operate in both the native language and in English, but they are very few and far between. What this means is that we have interesting perspectives from these native Asian scholars whose work is not actually influencing the work that those who are practicing in English are doing. And so you have two discrete universes that are not interacting when they really should be part of a more dynamic, more interactive ecosystem. If I think about, for example, my career as a PhD student all the way till now, we're seeing vast numbers of Asian students go to the West to learn media and communications. And what happens is when they return to their home countries, they continue to publish in English because that's how they can get their impact factors up. That's how their work can resonate with a Western audience. And so this also creates an entrenchment of Western-centric Anglophone paradigms that I was talking about. Because, you know, in order for you to sort of be able to speak to the more Anglophone audience, the inclination to use more Anglophone concepts, precepts is, of course, greater. Whereas from our personal interactions, we do know of native language Asian scholars who are more embracing of using Asian concepts, and that these kinds of applications of Asian concepts are unfortunately not percolating to the rest of scholarship in Asia. So these linguistic differences do prevent a greater exchange of ideas, and we feel that there should be more vigorous efforts made to create platforms where people can interact on more level linguistic field so that there can be a more meaningful exchange of ideas. Now, this is just from 2 days ago. This student, Rodrigo Zamith, is a really enterprising PhD student who is presenting at the ICA, and he's into big data. And I came across this, I think, thanks to Cindy. And this is basically his analysis of the representation at ICA 2013, which is going to happen in a couple of days' time. And so he says, the first thing I decided to do was to plot the data about all authors on a map. Unsurprisingly, North American and European institutions are quite well represented. Countries outside these two continents, except perhaps for Australia, China, Israel, Japan, Korea, Singapore, and Taiwan, are not very well represented in terms of numbers. So it's great that we have these Asian countries represented, but we're also looking at the omission of countries like Indonesia, Thailand, India, Philippines, very populous countries, again with tremendous diversity in terms of their internet usage, in terms of their mobile communication usage, that are not, you know, seeing a wider international stage. And we're not getting these insights into our overall understanding of the social impact of technology. And I just want to talk about that entrenchment of Western concepts. If you look at the case in point of online social networks, there's a great deal of research that's now being done in online social networks. And if you look at it, it's a highly complex social phenomenon, and yet very often all scholars turn to the Western concept of social capital. So this is usually from people such as Robert Putnam, Barry Wellman, and so on. And certainly social capital is a very useful concept for which to understand social media and online social networks. But we also have to consider that when you migrate this concept to Asia, where there are other cultural factors involved in social networks, and you're looking at concepts like Kwansi and Cheong in Korea and so on, that it really complicates online social networking. And I had a personal experience of this when I was looking at the media use of juvenile delinquents and youth at risk in Singapore. So these were kids who were in gangs and so on. And I was looking at how these kids were using Facebook. And one of them, a couple of them mentioned this whole thing about giving face. And one of them in particular mentioned how if he didn't give face, you know, he would have severe consequences. And that was when we realized that, you know, hang on, we've got to sort of break away from this notion of social capital. We've got to start thinking about this whole notion of face. And once we thought about their actions online in terms of giving face, not losing face, gaining face, we had a much more illuminating understanding of the ways in which they were managing their online image on the online social networks. So just to end off quite quickly, I wanted to end off on interesting, well, whimsical note, which is Rich Ling's latest book, Taken for Grantedness. He talks about what he calls the balloon index, where in Norway, on a particular national holiday, they would always sell balloons for children. And in the beginning, when mobile phones were really fresh and new, there were balloons shaped like mobile phones. And he says that in the most recent national holiday, he noted that there was all of one leftover mobile phone balloon from a previous year, right? And he sees this as a really interesting symbol of the fact that mobile phones are so taken for granted. They no longer have novelty value, so it doesn't make sense to make mobile phones in that shape. Now, on a somewhat more macabre note, I wanted to use this as an example of how, when we look at things from an Asian perspective, it puts a different or an alternative spin on things. And as an alternative to the balloon index, I wanted to present to you the burial index. And this is really the Chinese. When we send off our dearly departed, we believe in giving them a good send-off, and we cremate together with the dearly departed things that they will need in the afterlife. So these are actually things from a funeral supply shop in Singapore. And what people do is that, they'll buy them the Louis Vuitton wallet because they need money. And interestingly enough, they also sell mobile phones, right? And this is another one from this blog, and it says, being dead is no excuse not to check your email. But now you can buy an iPad as a funerary item. More interestingly, most recently rather, I came across this report of China, where there is another practice of tomb sweeping, Qingming, which is during April or so, we clean the tombs of our ancestors, and we also offer sacrificial offerings for their afterlife. And again, you can see, all of the latest HTC phones or whatever touchscreen tablets that you wanted to give to your dearly departed, you could do as well. And so I thought that this burial index was a nice Asian response to Rich Ling's balloon index. But really, I don't mean to be flippant, but that's my, I'm hoping to illustrate to you how, when you look at things from different geographical and cultural perspectives, we are all the richer for it. So finally, to end off, I just want to say that we are hoping that there could be more concerted efforts towards a more cosmopolitan approach towards communication and media studies. And because really of the complex cultural, social, political, and linguistic specificity of all these new internet worlds that are upon us. So thank you.
Thank you, Sun. Our next presentation is by Gillian, Bolsover, Bill Dutton, Ginette Law, and Sumitra Dutta. Bill will begin the presentation, and then Gillian will come in and conclude the presentation on social foundations of the Internet in China and the new Internet world, a cross-national comparative perspective.
I don't know whether this is just slow or not. Scott, am I doing this wrong?
I don't think so. It's just the computer big. It's slow self. Is it fun to come up? Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Yes, I'll start off. Then I'll give over to Gillian, who will show you some of the major findings that we came up with, and then I'll come back for some of the discussion. As I said before, I think, so much attention on the internet studies is given to new technical developments and how they move things along. We wanted to look at this question of the changing population of the internet, and as this shifting demography and population of the internet happens, what will be the changing social foundations, the values and attitudes that might shape the future of the internet. Ginette is a former OII student, who's a master's student who's now in Toronto and working with us, and Sumitra Dutta was at INSEAD when we began, and now he's at Cornell University. Neither of them could be here, but we were involved in projects with the World Economic Forum for several years, and actually we began this study trying to say, so much focuses on technology or the public policy arena. That is, what is the policy of the Chinese government or the US government, and how is shifting policy possibly affecting the future of the internet. And we thought, actually, very few people are looking at people on the ground, and what are the experiences, attitudes, uses of people on the ground, and how may they be a brake or a driver in terms of the future of the internet. So we worked with the World Economic Forum, and they were able to basically, they didn't fund us, but they enabled data to be collected globally, and we were analyzed the data for them and wrote a report for them, and then could use that data for our own research. And then we've recently gotten support from ICT Qatar, and that allows us to. We've been able to add more multilingual questionnaires to it, and actually add more countries to our survey. The whole impetus for this was this changing center of gravity of the internet. This illustrates probably, I mean, there are many graphs we could show you, but you can see this is the percentage of the internet population by different regions. And you can see that in the early years of the internet, North America in green was the most populous country online in terms of the percentage of the population online. And you can see that since 2002, North America has continually declined, and it will continue to decline. Asia, in yellow here, has gone to 43% of the global population, and that was in 2009. So that was the impetus behind our global internet. If you have this shift in the population of the internet from dominantly North American, Western European, to now Asian, Chinese, there are more Chinese online than Americans on the planet. Will this change the underlying values of people? And I'm wondering if you'll have to tell me if this is an Anglophone perspective, or what I would like to think of is an internet cultural perspective. I think we sort of see an internet culture developing that is different from we expected local cultures to shift value frameworks. And what we're finding is that there might be actually more of a global culture. We found, well, in the report we did for the World Economic Forum, there are 4 major themes that the online nations are certainly, the new online nations such as India, China, Brazil, others, are becoming the dominant nations in the new internet world, which is what we're calling the new internet world. Which is today's internet world, not the world of old, which was dominated by North America and Europe. And that the users in the developing a global internet culture. And what I mean by that is that they share many attitudes and values. For example, freedom of expression is sometimes as well adhered to in China, India, Brazil, as it is in North America. And in fact, one of the most surprising findings we found was that in some of the older internet countries, the countries who were early on online, such as the United States, there's more complacency about freedom of expression. And that you actually see a bit more support for freedom of expression in some of the countries that are newer members of the internet world, and where the internet is not taken for granted. So that in a sense there's a less taken for grantedness, and a much more supportive attitude about the value of the internet and freedom of expression. And finally, we also found that in some of the nations of the new internet world, where they're new entrants, there's more active use of the internet and more innovative use of the internet. So more content production, more use of the internet for all sorts of things, and you'll see this in our. We wondered, well, will this hold up? There was a number of weaknesses in our 2010 survey. It was only one language. I mean, can't look to gift horse in the mouth. I mean, it was a global survey, but we wanted to add more languages. We got support from ICT Qatar, and we were able to add languages. We also wanted more countries and a larger sample. And we also, in this paper, we want to know where China sits in this new internet world in terms of its values, the values and attitudes of users relative to others. We combined 2 surveys. We got support for a survey of the Middle East and North Africa, and we've used some of that support also to add more countries and languages to a replication of the World Economic Forum survey. We've combined these 2 surveys from the World Economic Forum in Qatar, and we have 11,000 now. We have 11,000 plus respondents in 63 countries, and it's the same survey and administered by 2 different survey organizations, ComScore donated their time for the World Economic Forum survey, and to Luna we purchased for doing the surveys in the Middle East and North Africa. And there are 63 countries. These are the countries, but we're not going to look at all of them. I'll hand over to Gillian now, and she'll show you how we tried to narrow it to China and the United States and the countries that they seem to represent best, the old internet world and the emerging internet countries. And then I'll come back.
So this was a list of the 63 countries that were in our data set. So one of the first problems in approaching the data set was finding a way to divide all these 63 countries based on the development of their internet populations. So basically, were these countries that were prominent in the old internet world, or had they only joined in the new internet world? And so when we plotted the historical rates of internet penetration in these 63 countries, we saw 5 different patterns emerging in terms of internet development. Which we've called early leaders, trailing leaders, rapid developers, emerging nations, and late developers. These are names that are still up for, if you have any better names for us, you feel free to tell us afterwards. But, so the early leading nations are nations like the US, Australia, Canada, and also the early developing East Asian nations like Korea, Japan. So these are nations that were prominent in shaping the old internet world. There's the trailing leaders group, which were nations which were online in the old internet world, but weren't really prominent in shaping it. That's southern and central European nations, and also early developing non-Western nations like Chile and Malaysia. Rapid developers, which was a quite small group within the data set, but that didn't really fit. Their development pattern was very, very different. They developed very quickly within 5 years, from having almost none of their internet population online to almost approaching these early leading nations like the US. There's the emerging nations, this fourth group, and these are the nations that are really changing the balance of gravity of the internet. This is China, Egypt, Brazil, Mexico. So this is the really important group in questioning whether the changing demographics of the internet will change global values and attitudes. And then the final group is these later developing nations who currently don't have a big role in building the new internet world, but likely will soon. So places like India, Thailand, Algeria. So this is a lot of data that we had as part of this survey, but for the purposes of this project, we're really only focusing, for the purposes of this paper, we're only really focusing on the 2 most influential groups, which is the early leading group and the emerging nations group, which contain the US and China respectively, which are the 2 most influential nations in shaping first the old and then now the new internet world. So for this paper, it seems like a sufficient operationalization in order to understand whether this influx of new users is changing the global internet uses and attitudes. So one of our first research questions for this paper was, is this new 2012 survey in 9 languages and with a much greater sample size, do the results confirm or mirror the results of the earlier 2010 survey? So 2 of the earlier results were that users in emerging nations created much more content, and also that they were much more sociable online. And so the results of this 2012 survey did confirm that. We asked users about 11 different types of content creation activities, which you probably can't read from back there, I'm sorry, but it's things like posting videos, posting podcasts, posting messages to discussion forums. And here you have the emerging nations like China in red, and the early leading nations like the US in blue. And this is the percentage of respondents who report that they do these content creation activities at least monthly. And you can see for each of these 11 different content creation activities that a significantly larger percentage of people in emerging nations report doing these activities, confirming the results of our 2010 survey. And the same was true for online sociability. We asked people how willing they would be to make friends with people online that they didn't first know offline, or how willing they would be to meet someone offline who they'd first met online. And users, again, in emerging nations were much more sociable online. But there's some people who would say, looking at these differences, that these differences that we see are embedded in the categorizations that we've created. Like, users in emerging nations are relatively newer to the internet, so they're likely to be more enthusiastic, they're likely to be producing more content, but this will even out over time. Or things like the users in emerging nations are the most enthusiastic about the internet. They're likely to be younger, richer, more educated compared to their national populations, and so they're more likely to be active online. So this is something that we really wanted to test in the data set. Are these differences, which we obviously see there, a result of the structural and demographic differences of the internet populations in these two different sets of countries, or could they be to do with underlying social, cultural, and geographic divisions that are part and parcel of whether nations were prominent in the old internet world or only joined in relatively in the newer internet world? So when we tested this, we found that the latter was the case, controlling for age, gender, education, relative income, time using the internet, and interest in the internet. These differences that we saw in content creation and in online sociability remained. For the more variables that in early leading nations, such as the US, affect our dependent variable in one way, had a different effect in emerging nations such as China. So for instance, this is a graph that shows the average number of items of content produced per year for a user based on the length of time using the internet. So in early leading nations like the US, the amount of content produced drops for the longer someone has been using the internet, whereas in emerging nations it stays relatively constant and much higher regardless of the length of time that the user has been using the internet. So from this we can conclude that it's not, these differences that we see are not a result of demographic and structural differences, but maybe to do with underlying cultural, social, geographic differences that are embedded in these definitions. But for this paper, in order to examine in more detail these differences between internet users and values, we chose to focus on China as a case study and China in comparison with the US. You all probably know, you're here, why China is an important country to study. Its large population and strong economy mean that it's the driving force in shifting this gravity of the internet, and also because China has a relatively unique and closed national internet sphere, user attitudes and uses could be the most different from those of typical early leading nations in the West, and indeed from some of the other countries in the emerging nations groups. This is what we wanted to test in the data, to see where China lay within our different countries. So one area that Chinese users really stood out was in their entertainment, leisure, and commerce uses of the internet. So 60% of Chinese respondents reported making an online purchase at least weekly, which is double that of the average in other emerging nations like Mexico, Brazil, and the amount of products bought online is about the same for early leading nations. For emerging nations, and it's China that really sticks out. It was the same for the percentage of respondents reporting that they used the internet to get music. Another area in which Chinese users really stood out, but in this area they were simply the peak of other emerging nations, was in their mobile use, which is, we were hearing a little bit about in the first presentation. About 75 to 80% of users in emerging nations said that they used their cell phones for playing games, listening to music, browsing the internet, and that was about 90% in China compared to only about 50% in early leading nations. So two areas in which China really stands out are their use of the internet for entertainment, leisure, and commerce. One area in which China doesn't stand out is in their opinions on censorship, privacy, control, and political speech. In these areas, China was about in line with other emerging nations. And from this supports the view that Bill kind of introduced earlier, that there is evidence of what we see as a common set of global internet values that are rooted in its development earlier in the West and are now common across the global population of internet users, despite different historical, cultural, political situations in which these users are located. One area that I want to point out in which Chinese users didn't stand out, and this is somewhat surprising to people, is in their reported level of political commentary online. About 50% of Chinese users report posting a political opinion online at least monthly, which is about average for emerging nations. Both emerging nations and China, it's about twice as much as in early leading nations and the USA.
And so we didn't ask users about what types of political subjects they were posting about, but I think that this is an important finding to look at because it's evidence that despite a more restrictive approach to posting political commentary online, it doesn't seem that that's having a chilling effect in terms of the frequency of posting political opinions online in China. So back to Bill for going over our summary.
A couple of minutes? Okay. Try to be very brief, but emerging nations, but also innovation has become, that's where really the vitality of internet users in the new and emerging world is actually much dramatically better than in the US and other leading nations. And what do we make of China becoming a leader in commercial entertainment and mobile internet use? I think some people dismiss that as basically saying in China it's all entertainment, it's only entertainment, and the internet is not as politically significant. But I think it's my view would be that it is not necessarily irrelevant or undermining political communication. If you look in two respects, it's very clear from our data that the internet is becoming dramatically important to the economy of China. If you look at online shopping and the commercial, leisure, entertainment use of the internet, it is becoming a very central component of the Chinese economy. Secondly, and one that you must be very careful with, that is that you would want to protect from a rational perspective. The other is that all internet media platforms are multi-purpose, okay? So think of the Madrid train bombing where text messaging was turned to political purposes. But all media, if you use media a lot for posting content, for communicating in all sorts of ways, for entertainment and leisure, these can be used politically. And you can see in China that actually, and the emerging nations, that people are posting politically relevant messages more than they are in the early leading nations. So that we think, even though people are very, looking at the policy pronouncements in China and some of the other leading early emerging nations, the people are becoming more pessimistic about a control culture. But we think that there's actually room for some optimism based on the social foundations of the internet in China and the other emerging nations, that it continues to support internet values of freedom of expression, privacy, concern over security, and so forth, and also exhibit real vitality in the innovative use of the internet. So I think we want to extend this. We don't know what will happen when the next group of nations develops, and we want to continue to enhance this survey so that we're more confident. But because both surveys, even with the limitations of our first survey, are coming up with very similar themes and findings, we have more confidence than I did 6 months ago in the rigor of the reliability of the findings that we have to date. So thank you.
Should I just...
Yeah. How did we go over? Okay, good.
So it's just lower, it's lower.
As he's setting this up, Iginio Gagliardone.
Done? Right.
I was close enough. That was pretty good.
Yeah, it's
Okay.
much better than the British usual pronunciation of my surname. Well, my presentation is going to be somehow complementary. I'm really happy to come at this point of what Bill said, because it looks more at the government perspective. What is China doing in relation with government in Africa? If I have to start by giving a straight answer to my question, is China shaping the internet in Africa? It would be a straight yes. And in a way, it cannot be otherwise. Just if we look at the magnitude of the support that China is giving to the media and telecommunications sector in Africa, especially after 2006, which was the year of the third forum of China-Africa cooperation. I just give you an example. I don't know if many of you have heard of CCTV Africa. CCTV Africa was an initiative launched by CCTV, China's international broadcasters, in Africa in January 2011. And in a very crowded, I see there is more of a price here, market for loyalties, a space where a lot of people, a lot of countries are trying to put their names and their visions. And it immediately became the largest operation of an international broadcasters on the African soil. And the research I'm going to present today is mostly about telecommunication. It's not about the media, but it's part of a larger project that looks both at media and telecommunication, Chinese media and telecommunication in Africa. So I know there is quite a bit of interest. So if there are questions of CCTV Africa, I would be happy to give an answer to that. But so if the question is a straight yes, probably it becomes more interesting to ask, is China shaping the internet in the direction that international organizations, NGOs, and governments expect China to shape the internet? In this area, there is not academic research, as far as I know. And there is a lot of policy papers, there is a lot of diplomatic assessment, and Hillary Clinton, and David Cameron, and so forth. And the kind of language is very much this one. China is trying to shape the rest of the world in its own image and trying to promote a Western media model. And an assumption like this one is based on the example of other donors, like the US. When the US provide media assistance to other countries, they try to do so as a way to expand a certain model, not their model because it is not a model, but certain values abroad. And the assumption is China is going to do the same. And as I will try to show with my presentations and some of the findings, this doesn't seem to be the case. It doesn't seem to be the case, first, at a discursive level. If you look at statements of Chinese officials, they tend to say, we have no interest whatsoever in exporting the Chinese model of the media, of the internet abroad. And it's also at the historical level, because it doesn't mean that China has never been interested in exporting its model. This quote is from Prime Minister Chu Enlai, 1964. It was the first time that a top level a prime minister was visiting Africa. And at that time, the idea was to oppose imperialism and colonialism and promote national independence. All this language of ideology today has completely disappeared from the discourse. And thirdly, and this is what I'm trying to do with this research, also at the empirical level, it seems that there is not at least a discursive attempt to promote the Chinese model abroad. But, and here is my third question, the fact that China is not discursively trying to support certain ideas that are at the core of, when I say China, I tend to mean the Chinese government, doesn't mean that these are not spreading. So the question becomes, how are they spreading if the mechanism is not the mechanism that we are able to recognize? And so this is what I'm trying to do, and I'm trying to do in this paper in two different ways. First, in suggesting a framework that better allows to understand the unique behavior of China in Africa. And second, by comparing two countries, which are Kenya and Ethiopia, that are neighbors, but are extremely different in terms of politics, approach to the internet, and also China has increased, has intervened massively in both countries. The result, as I will try to show, are very different. So I will start with the framework very quickly, because I don't want to delve too much into theories. This framework is part of an effort that we have started 2 or 3 years ago at the program in Media Law and Policy. We gather different scholars from Africa, from China, and from Europe, trying to understand which kind of frameworks we can use. So it was an attempt to de-Westernize the approach to media development, and so gaining a sense of how this is framed also in these very countries that are part of this relationship. Very quickly, if we decided to divide it into to look at the influence of China according to these 3 different dimensions. The ability of China to act as a prototype. When I say prototype, is someone to learn from. And of course, it's extremely difficult to say what is the Chinese internet. Is the one that Yang Guobin describes, the effervescence of the virtual space, or the one of Western NGOs saying, oh, it's the great firewall of China? Or, more interestingly, is the one that certain actors in developing countries are believing it's the Chinese model. And here there was a very interesting quote from WikiLeaks of a conversation between the American ambassador in Ethiopia and Sebadnega. Sebadnega is one of the ideologues of the Ethiopian government. And Sebadnega was saying, that was 2007, Ethiopia needs the China model to inform the Ethiopian people. And he was caught on record. Well, for some, it wasn't meant to be there, but it got into the public domain at some point. So if I have to find an operational principle, what is a prototype? The idea of a prototype is based on two prompts, as you can see here. On the idea of sovereignty, there was a white paper on the development of the internet in China in 2010, where the idea of sovereignty was very much stressed. And second, the idea of harmony. And harmony, I know is a bit basic, this idea is probably a buzzword and so forth, but what I mean for harmony is not just the inability to have a debate. We can see that the debate is very much present and vocal. It's a debate that doesn't disrupt the very foundation of the state. This is what I mean with debate. The case of partner, this is much simpler. The idea of partner is the amount of resources that China is providing to this African country to develop their own telecommunication and infrastructure. And I will look at one particular example of partnership is when the money are coming directly from Exim Bank, which is the Bank of Development, and in many cases, in all of the cases that I've studied, these money are used by Chinese companies to implement infrastructure. So it's what in development they call tied aid. You know, aid is disbursed, but is tied to a national champion. And the final one, the idea of a persuader, well, this is also familiar to many of you, is the idea of China supporting discursively certain ideas about the internet or about development. And so the reason of disaggregating these is just allowing empirical evidence to show whether or not when China acts as a partner, this is also promoting element of the prototype. Maybe this is not the case. And also help to de-ideologize a little bit the tension between the Eastern model and the Western model. And for example, to show, as I will try to illustrate in the case of Kenya, that some support can actually promote elements that we would say are part of a liberal conception of the internet and an information society. And I will try to use these and I'm done with setting the scene and with the real cases. Just a couple of words. This is very much a work in progress. This is part of a research of 4 countries in Africa, autocracies, democracies, and the analysis is just at the beginning. So don't consider it kind of a finished product. A couple of words about Ethiopia and Kenya, what they are before the China entered into the picture. Ethiopia is what we can call a one-party state. There are elections, but they don't really matter. Last election were won with 98% of the votes for the incumbent government, so you can't really call that a democracy. The previous election, the one in 2005, were really contested. And these also create violence in the streets, a lot of tension with the donor community, of which Ethiopia is still very much a darling, but a sort of strained relationship, especially in the case of human rights. And in the case of the internet, Ethiopia is the only country in Africa where there is still monopoly of internet provision. There is just one. The other one is Djibouti, but Djibouti has 1 million people. Ethiopia has 90 million people almost. So it's just one only internet service provider and owned by the government. Still, and this is the strange picture that I'm showing here, it's extremely committed to service delivery. What I'm showing here, and there's no time to go into it, is one of the strangest projects of e-government in the world. This is a plasma TV screen. There are tens of thousands of these plasma TV screens in most of the schools and the government offices of Ethiopia. They use internet protocol to communicate in the video conferences. The idea is the prime minister can be visible to every corner of the state to instruct people on what they should be doing and how they should be doing it. Going to Kenya is exactly the opposite. Not politically, but if we look at the development of the internet. Politically is a vibrant but troubled democracy. And they also had very contested election in 2007. Also violence in the street, more ethnic violence, political violence, also straining the relationship with the donors, saying we need peace to have development. In the case of the internet, it's one of the first countries in the world to liberalize and it was the fastest and cheapest in the whole of Africa. Great emphasis on an international agenda. Kenya was the first country to have an open data initiative. There is a lot of emphasis on accountability. So what happens when China enters into the picture? In Ethiopia, there was a very strong tension because of the fact that in Ethiopia, telecommunication is still a monopoly. As I said, is the only one in Africa in terms of internet provision. I will just read a couple of words from when I interviewed him, he was the head of the ICT agency, now he's the Minister of Information, and he said, monopoly is a crucial factor. It's exactly because ICTs are so important and they have the capacity to penetrate every aspect of our lives that we have to make sure that it is the state that is in charge of using and implementing them. So, but at some point after 2005, they started having a problem. There is no example of a country, a developing country, extending access in a regime of monopoly. So either you liberalize, as many countries have done, or what? In this case, China came to the rescue. China came with the rescue with, as far as I know, the largest loan in the telecommunications sector is the Ministry of Africa, $1.5 billion from Exim Bank given to ZTE to do exactly what I said earlier, so to expand access to the internet and to mobile phones. There is a second tranche that is coming in now of $1.3 billion. So almost $3 billion that China has made available for the Ethiopian government to realize its own vision. So without China, in this way, it would have been impossible. As far as I know, we can run a counterfactual, but to expand access to the internet and to the mobile phone in the way that it is done. In the case of Kenya, the picture is extremely different, but to a point. In the case of Kenya, the first presence of China in the telecommunications sector was not through the government, not through a loan, but it was as a contractor of the Kenyan government, which wanted to build, let's say, this national fiber optic infrastructure in the country. ZTE and Huawei, they sort of split part of the country. They were doing one the north, one the west, and a French company was doing the rest. So it was just a contractor. Last year, something more interesting and similar to what is the case of Ethiopia, the Exim Bank provided $71 million to further expand the infrastructure. So we are talking about infrastructure again. And Huawei was the implementer. So again, the idea of tied aid. And this was for the same, this is fiber optic that is controlled by the state. It's managed by the state and it's sold out to whoever. It can be a private operator, it can be a state operator. And at some point, in a very complex and vibrant market, Safaricom, which is the largest, Safaricom is owned for Alphabet by Vodafone, says, wait a minute, we don't want to depend on the state to provide data to our own customers. We want to set up our own infrastructure. They put $160 million, and what do? They hire Huawei to do the infrastructure. So as you can see, in this case, there is much more an ability to adapt to the crowded market, a complex market, and China is simply sort of seeing what the situation is, what the network is, and sort of fitting into this picture into the in creative way. So if we move to the second bit, to the prototype, these are just quotes, and I will sort of quickly run you through. I don't know how much I'm doing with time. Okay. And this is the WikiLeaks cables that I mentioned earlier. Stephen Nega, one of the powerful members of in the Ethiopian government. The second one, this is the CEO of one of the largest ICT companies in Ethiopia. A much more instrumental vision of China. The idea is, it was used as a leverage against the World Bank, and I want to use, Mele simply said that the World Bank could go to hell, literally. And Ethiopia didn't need them. And after that, they came back running. In the case of Kenya, it's different, but not that different. So on the one hand, this person is Bitangen Demo. He's the Permanent Secretary for Information and Communication. It's saying, well, they're winning the other mind. We like China, but at the same time, we are a liberal state. We're not going to change. We don't need China in order to envision a different idea of the information society. Here, the second quote is from the head of the Media Council, and again, this instrumental idea of China. China is something to fall back when there is a need to do so. So we have this complex. It's not, it's not the one that is the pro-China. We're not in a Cold War scenario. Either you're pro-China or against China. And you can play with different elements in this relationship. And finally, the idea of a persuader. This is very quick. While the US and other countries are very much ideological in their understanding of the internet and articulating ideas of the internet, this Ends of the Internet campaign was this campaign that was endorsed by Congress just before the World Conference of International Telecommunication in Dubai. So we say countries, governments should not regulate the internet. In the case of China, as far as I know, the people that I interviewed are people in government, civil society, and the private sector, and Chinese agents in both in government and for Huawei and so forth. There is no signal of an idea of the internet that is put out there. That doesn't mean there is not ideas of the media. In the case of CCTV Africa and China Daily, there is this idea of positive reporting that is very much articulated, that we have to provide a good image of Africa. Africa has been bashed in by the BBC, by the CNN. Africa is a good story to tell, and we want to be part of this. But in the case of the internet, it doesn't seem to be the case. So I'm coming to the conclusion. I have two conclusions. The first one is pretty simple and straightforward. What China is doing, this is a very happy South African president shaking the hands of Xi Jinping and say, well, Africa is coming into a country, being in Ethiopia or Kenya, and simply doing what it's asked. And in the case of Ethiopia, it's providing enormous amount of money to support the vision of the Ethiopian government, which is unsustainable. That's fine. In Kenya, it's a very crowded market, a smaller player, and that's what happens. At the same time, these doesn't mean that this is neutral. China tends to work with governments. Other, let's say, governments like the American government, the US governments, tends to have more issue-based approach. We have to promote internet freedom, and we can work with the civil society, with the private sector, with the states. It depends. In the case of China, it is always the state, no matter what. There is no relationship with the civil society. And this is emboldening the state. I have another quick quote from Eric Hirschman. Eric Hirschman is the person who invented Ushahidi. He is very much respected innovator in Kenya, and he said last month when we met, the state is getting stronger. A lot of actors such as Huawei are working with the government. They are not coming to us. They are not in the grassroots. They are not paying attention to what we are doing. And he was worried about it and say, this is not a good time for the civil society in Kenya. And this is leading me to a second and more complicated question, and very conclusion, and very tentative one. So it might not be very clear, but this is just, I'm sort of taking this as an opportunity to just sort of share with you some hypotheses that are a bit far-fetched, but I will give it a try. And the example is, Xi Jinping started, shall I not, and who knows. And it's based on this idea that also as it's coming out from your research, it seems that this idea of harmony, the state is controlling, the state has, it's sort of spreading. And it's definitely spreading in Ethiopia and in Kenya. And I will provide you a couple of examples before concluding. And also this idea of sovereignty, they are spreading. But it doesn't seem to be a direct connection between China's coming to these countries and these ideas gaining more traction in this country. So how is this happening? And this is what I'm struggling here at this point. Because it seems that this is part of a much larger trend in which China is just a very small component. And here I look more at the ideas of development, the idea of development aid and how things are changing. Because it seems to me that in a way, it's Western donors that are sort of setting the scene and the discourses for a new player like China and others to play into this narrative. Because there is always this emphasis about the difference between the East and the West, but from what I have seen in many sectors, the West and the East in developing countries are not that different. what they are supporting is this idea of development, the idea of a peaceful development, and the idea of service delivery. So it's not very much about voice, but it's about providing things to people. And it seems there is a lot of linkages there. And I will provide you, and this is also allowing this idea of sovereignty, this idea of harmony to spread. I will just provide you with 2 examples, and then I will really conclude. Just this one. So in Ethiopia, in 2010, for the first time of jamming Voice of America, and the Prime Minister, the late Prime Minister, saying we're not doing it, he said, yes, we're doing it. And so what? It's our right to defend our state. And Ethiopia is a country, and of course it was uproar, but nothing happened. And Ethiopia is a country that is loved by the British government because it delivers aid down to the ground. It's very efficient, as autocracies can be. So in a way, there is this privileged relationship with them. If you look at Kenya, the same here, March 2013, there were elections, and SMS were taken down, and bloggers were imprisoned. And again, this narrative of harmony and peace were not set up by China, it was set up by the British and American government, saying we need a peaceful development. So there is this problem of development aid, let's say Western aid or certain agencies, of a kind of a big wishy-washy idea of development. We want development, we want peace, but we also want human rights and so forth. When in a world without China, this was possible, because you can say if you want A and B, you have to give a C and D as well. And when China is there, China is making this whole system explode, because well, we can talk about A and B, but for C and D, China is there. So it's becoming this idea, this instrumentalist idea that I was using before, it's much present, and peace, containment of the democratic space, these are becoming something on which China, the West and the East are agreeing very much, and China is simply providing the resources for something that is already, putting machinery that is already in place to go in one direction or another. I'm done. Thank you.
So we started this panel with a call for and problematizing the critique in terms of the need for cross-national research and in terms of thinking differently about our data, and we certainly have seen some great examples of this. I'd like to open the floor for questions. We've got about 20 minutes, less than 20 minutes. Mm-hmm. Would you like to?
Bill, just one question on the research. In looking at the data, do you see the same significant differences if you just sort of focus on mobile users in the different categories? You're just looking at not just mobile users, but smartphone users. Are they are the smartphone users in the 5 different groups? Do they have the same behaviors in terms of content production, or are they still very, very different?
Well, there is a difference. I mean, for example, in Britain, United States, and most what we call, most smartphone users are what we call next generation users.
Okay.
So they are using multiple computers, tablets, readers, smartphones, and so these devices just complement existing media. I think there's probably a large proportion of next generation users in China and Asia as well, but there might be a larger proportion of people who are relying more on a single mobile device, perhaps, in some areas. But like in the Middle East, next generation users are the most common thing as well.
Yeah, because my question goes to, is it a function of what category they're a part of, or what technology they have at hand in terms of their content production? So like the people who are downloading music or buying music, buying things online, doing all these services, is that related more towards the technology they use, or is it more related to what group they're part of?
The people where people are using multiple technology, where the people who are using smartphones are doing more entertainment than they did before, than people without, and also more posting of content. So there is an effect. It seems to be that devices have an effect independent of demographic factors. But it's mainly to augment things people want to do anyway, but to make them more accessible, more prominent. You agree, or do you?
Yes. So.
Good.
So there was, I mean, looking at, of course, yes, well, I completely agree. No, there was a difference in looking at just smartphone users when you're looking at those in early leading nations and those in emerging nations. Some of those differences that we saw in terms of content production was still there. It's not just to do with the devices that people have. But yes, devices do make a difference, but it's not, it's not that this is completely erasing the differences that we see.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Very, very, very interesting presentations. I have a question for Ms. Lim. Maybe allowed. On your concept of Asia, to what extent, and this is very much a question, to what extent can we use Asia as a category? As in, in which way does Asia exist? Does it exist as a political project that might be comparable to something like the EU? Does it exist as an economic sphere in which there is a clear, relatively bounded sphere of activity? Does it exist geographically in the sense that we can see, for example, migration? How do we construct Asia, and why? I guess the question is, why should we take Asia, and which Asia should we take as a unit of analysis, and for which questions? And second, I sympathize with your point that a lot of comparative data simply isn't there, and a lot of data that is there cannot be used for comparison. But as academics, surely our job is to produce data. And so the question is, what are the approaches that we need to consider to produce the data in connection with my first point, to analyze Asia, qua Asia, in particular levels or for particular questions?
So on all of those examples of the different ways in which we can conceptualize Asia, there is tremendous dispute. So whether it's as an economic zone, for example, there's actually considerable overlap between certain spheres of Asia which are considered to be more, for one of a better term, more economically developed. And these are also, coincidentally, the parts of Asia that are trading very actively and forming trade partnerships with countries from outside what is considered Asia, right? And then there's also the whole idea of whether or not Australia is actually part of the bigger grouping of Australasia, and whether people in Asia or even in Australia are willing to submit to this whole concept of Australasia. So really, when you talk about the fact that there are so many different Asias and there are so many different conceptualizations, that's completely spot on. I think as an academic who's trying to somehow come to grips with a meaningful comparison, we're looking at Asia as a region which seems to be interacting very intensely in terms of trade, in terms of labor flows, and there's also mutual influence in terms of the kinds of technology that are being adopted within the region. And broadly, from our perspective, with the kinds of institutions that I've been interacting with, we are looking at Southeast Asia plus East Asia to be the somewhat conventional grouping of Asia that we're looking at when we're looking at Asian research. And of course, I'm sorry, there's also the South Asian countries as well. So these would be the most, I probably could say that this would be the most common way by which Asia is conceived in terms of, sorry, for academic purposes, from where I've been operating. In terms of your second question about why it is the fact that it's academics' job to generate data, that's completely true. The problem is that when we get grants, our grants are never sufficiently large enough to canvas so wide a swathe of Asia. And so we end up cherry picking. So I remember when I was doing a multinational comparison of privacy perceptions within Asia, we cherry picked Beijing, we cherry picked New Delhi, we cherry picked Seoul, we cherry picked Singapore, and so on. And yes, in some ways it was quite helpful in terms of generating data that we were interested in. But at the same time, we were also deeply mindful of the fact that there was so much of Asia that was not being included. When you're looking at pan-European data that's being funded by the European Union, you're looking at much more generously funded data collection that academic grants just cannot match. So that is one of the obstacles that we face as academics in terms of wanting to generate sufficiently robust, sufficiently comprehensive pan-Asian data.
Patrice,
Mhm.
but I wanted to just comment, and you didn't ask me, but the one of the most promising and interesting findings that came out of our paper was that Gillian's analysis, where she was able to find trajectories where countries really grouped. And so the very fact that we are actually, and you may disagree with this, and it would be great to get opinions on this, but so Japan falls more with the US and Western Europe in terms of its trajectory of internet adoption. So we would group countries by looking empirically at the trajectory of how they adopted the internet. We found those 5 really tightly knit groups, so that they really do follow exactly the same path, so that the 3 Middle Eastern, North African countries have this rapid development. So we're breaking away from traditional just geographical demarcations, and I think that's promising, because we actually might have a different empirical basis for finding groups of countries that maybe behave similarly in the internet world.
And it seems to me that sort of this discussion, and I don't want to get into deeply because of time, but this is a call for open data, and maybe this is something that as academics we should do more, as in we tend to be tremendously protective of our data, but now thanks to the internet, we don't have to have these in filing cabinets, we can actually put them online for other people to use, and we possibly don't do it enough yet.
The World Economic Forum data is open.
Yeah.
And other funded data are open, but one of the issues that comes up, especially in the biomedical and in bioengineering, is that there aren't schema necessarily available for you to be able to utilize the data, and they're in the process of trying to develop those for people around the world to utilize the data.
Thank you very much for all 3 presentations. I'd like to ask the question of the second team. Your presentation was truly eye-opening, and I'd like to ask for 2 clarifications. One, if you could clarify the term innovation, the way you use, because it was clear from your presentation that in newly joining countries, users upload more user-generated data, and it seemed to me that you equal this with more innovation. Now, innovation may be defined in many ways. I think the templates created by Facebook or YouTube may be also seen as innovations. And if we look at China, we see that the services they develop are more or less copycats or cherry picks of the actually American Facebook templates. So the first, this is, I mean, just uploading that what my kids are doing, is it really innovation? The second question I'd like to ask is about political commenting in newly internetizing countries. If I heard correctly, you suggested there is more political discussion among some of the newcomers. I would appreciate if you could comment on that. I recall reading a paper comparing some American service and Weibo in terms of the proportion of political discussions. And I recall the argument that in the American service, it was Twitter actually, the number of top comments and top most popular, most reposted comments had to do more with news and current affairs, as opposed to Weibo, where these top popular comments and reposts had to do with celebrities and entertainment.
Well, maybe I'll take a first crack. I mean, yeah, innovation might, I accept that. I might be maybe too broadly defining it, but empirically what we found is that the degree to which people are creating content rather than just consuming content is much higher in the emerging nations and in China than in the old leading nations, where, you know, the impression is that, well, that's where Facebook is and so forth, so we'll be posting a lot, but actually it's dramatically higher in the, and I think creating content is more I think that's a direction in which the internet is moving. I mean, Internet 1.0, Web 1.0 was basically, you know, looking at websites and sending email, and now we've got a much more interactive population using the internet. And then if you look at some of where the internet where services are going in terms of online banking, shopping, gosh, China is putting people, making people look like they're left in the dark in terms of utilizing the new technology for online shopping and banking and so forth. So I would say that given that innovative use of the internet in terms of pushing the direction in which the internet's developing and the new applications are developing, it's very likely that what will follow is actually more innovation in application development and services. You might want to comment on that, or you thought that there were already signs of this, right?
Yeah, in terms of, I mean, point taken about innovation and how we are calling these users innovative and how that relates to the questions we're actually asking them in the survey. I mean, I think another thing that's interesting to look at in terms of innovation is from the national companies that are catering to these populations that are doing much more things. The example that I didn't get to mention was looking at mobile technology and the way that Chinese companies are being very much more innovative because they are catering to these populations that are producing more content, are being more sociable, and so the apps and the platforms that you see catering to these populations are at the cutting edge of mobile development. In reference to the question about political commentary, I think within the survey we asked people, how often do you post your political opinions online? We also asked them how do you use the internet to express yourself and things like this. So that's always going to be self-reported. I remember the paper that you're talking about. I'm actually presenting something tomorrow where I'm looking at comparing Weibo and Twitter. So it's a very different methodology when you're asking people as compared to when you're actually looking at the text that people are putting up there. But within the data, we did see many more people reporting that they had posted political commentary online, and I think this does fit with a lot of the previous research that was done in Western contexts about the very, very small proportion of people who actually post political comments online. So it may be that there is a lot of political commentary that goes on the Western internet, but the proportion is smaller. That's something that remains to be looked at. But we just flat out ask people, how much do you post political comments online?
Okay, question for Iginio about because sorry I missed the first couple of minutes of your presentation, but I still want to clarify your answer to your title. Okay, is China shaping the internet in Africa? It sounds like this is I'm trying to come to the conclusions after hearing your excellent presentation. Is first, China is not shaping the internet in Africa. It's not China or the Chinese government. It's Huawei and CTE are shaping. So is this correct? And the second understanding from your is that China is not shaping Africa. Okay, Huawei and CTE is not shaping Africa. They are shaping the bureaucratic, the statist, Africa, but not the civil society, not the grassroots Africa. Okay, so these are the two. I feel more comfortable thinking about this. But then the third one, which is the one I really want to ask you about, is that there are different Africas. Okay, so the Ethiopia, maybe you can group it together with Sudan, with Zimbabwe. Okay, these are the statists. Okay, that are traditional friends with the Chinese government. Okay, but then there would be Kenya, South Africa, Egypt, Nigeria, or Ghana. Okay, then there will be the other second group that you are trying to use. And then for these two different Africas, there would be different model for the Chinese to play a role or not an important role. Are these correct?
Well, on the first one, I was shocked myself. I've been doing research on these China and Africa relationship in the media sector for some time, and the idea that I had of the role of Huawei and CTE was there's this idea of tied aid. In many countries, the first mover is Exim Bank, And usually this is part of a bilateral relationship. It can be between a prime minister and someone in an African country and someone else in China. And the idea was the ZTE and Huawei come second, and they tend to sort of accept the framework in which, and that was sort of true up to last year. Then I go to Kenya and Ethiopia again this year, and I'm learning that ZTE in Kenya is taking Huawei to court because of a bid of the Kenyan government. And ZTE, or I may get it the other way around. So I think it's more Huawei that's taking ZTE to court and saying, you know, you didn't do things right, and we want to get our money back. So, and speaking with some very honest PR person at Huawei, they're saying that the embassy is quite mad with us because, you know, we are ruining all this image of China as this unitary country where everybody agrees with things. And these are the same things is happening in Ethiopia. The loan that I put out there in 2012, the money are not being disbursed because there are some negotiations that are going on, and Huawei is trying to put its cause as strong as possible, and saying ZTE is quite incompetent. They don't really know what they are doing. We are much better. And ZTE is saying, well, we are the legacy. So there is a lot of competition there. So in a way, I agree with you that ZTE and Huawei are changing things on their own. They are independent from the Chinese government. But still, there are, you know, in the case of ZTE, you know that it's partially owned by the government. Huawei is, so it's the message is complicated. And so it's very difficult. And that's why I said when I consider partner, it's just when money are coming from Exim Bank. The other very complicated relationship that Huawei has in other countries without Exim Bank being part of the picture is not something I take into consideration. But moving to the one that you really wanted to ask, this is very much true. I very much agree with you. There is not one Africa. There is, even if China is learning about the multiplicity of Africa right now, and there is a lot of misconception of what Africa is back in China. But that's why, as part of this research, we are looking at two autocratic countries, which are Ethiopia and Rwanda, and two democracies, which are Ghana and Kenya. So the expectation is trying to see, as I tried to show at the end, who is in charge. The relationship with Africa, between an African government and China, being the government of, is empowering, is increasing African agency. What do we mean with African agency? Is the government is representative of the people, or indeed is also the question about the civil society. Who is representative? Who decides? So maybe we should put more attention to the institution in Africa.
I regret that we are over time. Thank you for wonderful questions and a great panel.